Emily starting to suspect her husband and sister may be having an affair, or are beginning to think about doing so.
The bell above the door tinkled softly as Sarah pushed it open, stepping into the dim, musty air of the antique shop. William followed behind her, raising an eyebrow at the sheer amount of forgotten trinkets crammed into the tiny space. The scent of old wood and aged paper hit them immediately, giving the room an oppressive weight. "Are you sure this is the place?" William whispered, his voice echoing off the worn shelves and dusty lampshades. "This is it," Sarah replied, smiling as she walked further into the cluttered space. She had always loved exploring old stores like this, places where time seemed to stand still, each item carrying the weight of countless stories untold. It was a passion of hers, one William didn't entirely understand, but supported nonetheless. The shop's lighting was poor, with only a single flickering bulb in the center of the ceiling casting faint shadows across the floor. At first glance, it seemed as though the shop was empty. The glass cabinets were filled with tarnished jewelry, the shelves lined with cracked porcelain dolls, dusty books, and once-cherished ornaments. But as they moved deeper into the shop, something caught Sarah's eye, a glint of brass from a tall object in the back corner, half hidden by an old velvet curtain. She stepped closer, drawn to it instinctively. It was a clock, tall, ornate, and unlike anything she had ever seen before. The case was carved from dark mahogany with intricate designs of twisting vines and strange, almost human-like faces etched into the wood. Its brass pendulum was motionless behind the glass, yet there was something disturbingly lifelike about the way the clock stood, waiting as though it was aware of their presence. "William, look at this," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with wonder. William joined her, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something else, unease maybe. "It's beautiful, I guess, but it's kind of creepy, don't you think?" Before Sarah could respond, a voice cut through the silence, hoarse and dry. "I see you found my finest piece." They both turned to see the shopkeeper emerge from the shadows. He was a tall man, hunched slightly with age, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a battered hat. His bony fingers trembled as he wiped his hands on a ragged apron. "It's a remarkable clock," Sarah said, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had crept up on her since they laid eyes on the object. "Aye," the old man rasped, his gaze fixed on the clock, as if it held him captive. "Remarkable indeed, but be careful with it. That one's not for the faint of heart." William chuckled awkwardly. "It's just a clock, right? How much for it?" The shopkeeper's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the air seemed to thicken with something unseen. "You don't understand, lad. That clock is special. It's been with me for longer than I care to admit. Strange things happen to those who own it." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but the pull of the clock was undeniable. She couldn't explain it, but she needed to have it. The weight of its presence filled her with a strange, unsettling excitement. "We'll take it," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. William shot her a surprised glance but didn't argue. He knew better than to question Sarah when she had that look in her eye. The shopkeeper hesitated, his lips trembling as if he wanted to say more, to warn them again. But then he simply nodded and disappeared into the back room, leaving them alone with the clock. As the pendulum gave a soft creak, shifting ever so slightly, Sarah reached out to touch the wood, her fingers grazing the intricate carvings. For a brief second, she thought she felt warmth, like the clock was alive beneath her touch. "Come on, let's get this thing home," William said, snapping her out of her trance. Outside, the wind picked up, howling softly as they loaded the clock into their car. Neither of them noticed the faint ticking sound that began the moment they left the shop. The shopkeeper, watching from the window, sighed deeply. Another pair of souls lost to time. The antique clock stood tall in the corner of their living room, its polished surface gleaming in the dim light of the setting sun. It fit perfectly, or so Sarah thought, like it had been meant to occupy that space all along. William wasn't as sure. Since they'd brought it home, an unsettling atmosphere had fallen over the house. Nothing obvious, but enough to make him glance over his shoulder more often than usual. The clock hadn't even started ticking yet, but its silent presence was enough to fill the room with an unnerving stillness. "Have you wound it yet?" William asked, running a hand through his hair as he watched Sarah dust the clock's glass casing for what must have been the third time since they got home. "Not yet," she replied, a small frown tugging at her lips. "I couldn't find the key. The shopkeeper didn't give us one." William shrugged, heading toward the kitchen. "Maybe it's in one of the drawers. I'll check later." As evening slipped into night, they settled into their usual routine. Dinner was quiet, save for the faint clinking of silverware against plates, but both of them felt it, that strange electric tension humming just below the surface. It was as if the clock demanded attention, even in its silence. Later, as they prepared for bed, Sarah paused at the living room door, her eyes lingering on the clock. Though the house was still, she could have sworn she heard something faint, like the rhythmic pulse of a heartbeat. Tick, tick, tick. She blinked and shook her head, laughing at herself. "It's just in your mind. You're tired." With that, she left the room, switching off the lights. The night was restless. Sarah tossed and turned in bed, her sleep interrupted by strange dreams. Dreams of shadowy figures moving in the corners of her vision, always out of reach. And beneath it all, there was that sound again. Tick, tick, tick. Her eyes fluttered open, her breath shallow. The bedroom was quiet, dark. She turned toward William, who was still sound asleep, his steady breathing the only noise in the room. But something was wrong. That sound, so faint it could have been imagined, echoed in her ears. Tick, tick. She sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. Was it coming from the living room? Slowly, Sarah slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway, her feet cold against the wooden floor. As she neared the living room, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was the unmistakable ticking of the clock. But we never wound it. Her pulse quickened as she entered the room. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting long, pale shadows across the floor. The clock stood in its corner, looming and dark, its pendulum swaying back and forth. Tick, tick, tick. Sarah stood frozen, watching the clock. It moved with unnatural smoothness, the pendulum swinging with a rhythmic precision that felt almost hypnotic. There was no key, no reason for it to be working, and yet it ticked on, oblivious to the logic of the world around it. She took a step closer, her breath catching in her throat. The intricate carvings on the wood seemed to shift in the dim light, the faces etched into the mahogany, almost watching her. Her hand reached out, trembling, as if some invisible force guided her toward the pendulum. As her fingers brushed the glass, the ticking suddenly stopped. The silence was suffocating. Sarah's heart raced as she pulled her hand back, fear gripping her chest. She stood there staring at the now motionless clock, its pendulum frozen mid-swing. The house was silent once more, but something had changed, something she couldn't name, but felt deep in her bones. Backing away slowly, she turned and hurried back to the bedroom, her steps quickening with every second. When she slipped into bed beside William, her skin was clammy, her breath uneven. She lay there wide-eyed in the darkness, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. But as her eyes closed again, she couldn't shake the feeling that something in the house had stirred, that something was watching. From the corner of the living room, the clock sat in stillness once more, yet the faintest echo of ticking could still be heard, as though time itself was holding its breath. And deep within the clock, unseen by either of them, a mechanism shifted ever so slightly. The ticking became part of their lives. At first, Sarah convinced herself it was a quirk of the clock, a mechanical oddity that defied explanation but wasn't necessarily sinister. William tried to ignore it entirely, chalking it up to Sarah's imagination, though the unease never truly left him. Days turned into a week, and the sound never stopped. No matter where they were in the house, it followed them, softly at first, almost like background noise. But at night it grew louder, echoing through the halls as if the walls themselves were filled with gears turning just out of sight. Sarah, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, decided to look into the origins of the clock. It had become more than a mystery, it was an obsession. The memory of the old shopkeeper's warning nagged at her, along with the creeping sensation that the clock was doing more than just ticking. She sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, fingers tapping at the keys as she searched for any mention of the clockmaker. Matthias Grendel. The name had come up on a website about antique timepieces, an old forum where collectors discussed rare and unique clocks. As Sarah scrolled through page after page of grainy black and white photos and cryptic user comments, she finally found what she was looking for: a mention of Grendel's clocks. Matthias Grendel had been a master craftsman in the late 1800s, known for his precision and artistry. His clocks were highly sought after, not just for their beauty, but for the peculiar sense that they operated with a life of their own. Some collectors believed he had dabbled in occult practices, though most dismissed the idea as superstition. Sarah leaned in closer, reading about how Grendel's clocks were said to have unpredictable effects on those who owned them. The accounts were vague, but the descriptions all carried the same undercurrent of fear. There were rumors of sickness, madness, and disappearances, families who bought Grendel's clocks and were never heard from again. But the most disturbing detail was a quote from an old newspaper article, dated over a century ago. Grendel's greatest masterpiece was said to control not just time itself, but the souls of those who dared to own it. Each tick brings its owner closer to doom, the clock feeding on the very essence of life. Sarah sat back in her chair, her heart racing. Could the clock in their living room really be one of Grendel's cursed creations? It sounded absurd, like something out of a Gothic novel, but the ticking that filled the silence of the house felt anything but harmless. She rubbed her temples, trying to make sense of what she'd read. She didn't believe in curses, but there was no denying that the clock had changed something in their home. And the idea that it might be slowly draining their lives with each passing second sent a chill down her spine. Her search led her deeper into Grendel's history. He had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1897, vanishing from his workshop without a trace. His body was never found, though some believed he had transcended death through the clocks he created, binding his soul to the mechanisms in order to live forever. A soft sound broke her concentration, a faint creak from the living room. She glanced toward the doorway, her stomach knotting with unease. The ticking had grown louder again, more insistent, as if the clock was reminding her of its presence. "Sarah?" William's voice startled her. She turned to see him standing in the hallway, his face pale. "I heard something strange." "From the living room. Do you hear it?" She nodded, her pulse quickening. "It's the clock, William. I think something's wrong with it. I've been reading about the man who made it. He wasn't just a clockmaker, he was involved in something darker." William's eyes narrowed, the skepticism still there but fading. "Darker? What are you talking about?" "I think the clock is cursed," she whispered, the words sounding ridiculous even to her own ears. "The man who made it. People say his clocks trapped souls, that they fed on people's lives. I know it sounds crazy, but I can feel it. Something's wrong with this clock." William ran a hand through his hair, glancing toward the living room where the ticking was now unmistakable. He opened his mouth to argue, but stopped. For a moment they both stood in silence, the rhythmic ticking filling the house louder and louder. "What do we do?" William asked, his voice hushed. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her fingers trembling as she shut the laptop. "But I think we need to get rid of it, before it's too late." The clock, unseen but ever present, continued its relentless countdown. Tick, tick, tick. The ticking clock followed them everywhere, each beat heavy with something sinister, like a constant reminder that their time was slipping away. Days blurred together, and the strange occurrences grew worse. It wasn't just the clock anymore. Sarah and William were beginning to feel the effects, their bodies and minds subtly fraying at the edges. It started with the dreams. At first they were disjointed, odd glimpses of dark hallways and shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. But as the nights passed, the dreams became more vivid and more terrifying. Sarah woke up drenched in sweat almost every night. The image of a man with hollow eyes staring at her from the foot of the bed burned into her mind. His face was gaunt, skeletal, his skin stretched too tightly over his bones. He never moved, just watched, as though he were waiting for something. And behind him, the clock always ticked, growing louder with each passing second until it drowned out everything else. William, too, had been waking up at odd hours, confused and disoriented. He swore he'd heard someone whispering his name, their voice like the rustle of dead leaves. But when he turned on the lights, there was nothing. No one. Just the empty house, the ever-present ticking, and the sense that something was terribly wrong. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Sarah caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror and gasped. She looked older, her face pale, her eyes hollow, with faint lines etched around her mouth and eyes. It was as though the last week had aged her by years. She pressed a hand to her cheek, her skin cold to the touch. Her thoughts went immediately to the clock. Its constant ticking had become unbearable, its presence inescapable. No matter where she went in the house, it seemed to follow her. Worse still, she had begun losing time. Minutes, sometimes hours, would pass without her noticing. She'd glance at the clock, and the hands would be in a different position, as though mocking her with the time she'd lost. "William?" she called, her voice trembling as she left the bathroom. "Something's happening to us. I feel older." William was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall. He turned slowly to look at her, and the moment she saw his face, her breath caught in her throat. He looked just as worn as she did, his hair slightly grayer, the lines on his forehead deeper. "Yeah," he muttered. "I noticed." They stared at each other for a long moment, the unspoken truth settling between them like a cold weight. The clock was draining them, stealing their time bit by bit, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. "We have to get rid of it," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "It's killing us." William nodded, but his expression was distant. "I've tried. I tried moving it last night while you were asleep. But it's heavy, Sarah. I can't even budge it. It's like it's rooted to the floor." Her heart sank. She had felt it too, the way the clock seemed to resist any attempt to move it, as though it were more than just a piece of furniture. It was as if the clock had claimed its place in their home, and no amount of force would remove it. "We need help," she said, her voice urgent now. "Maybe someone knows how to break the curse. Someone who knows about Grendel's work." William stood slowly, his hand raking through his hair. "I don't know if anyone can help us, but we have to try." The ticking, louder now, filled the room as if mocking them. Sarah's eyes flicked toward the living room, where the clock stood in the corner, its pendulum swaying steadily back and forth. The carvings on its surface seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light, the faces etched into the wood grinning grotesquely. "We don't have much time left, William," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic ticking. She could feel it now, time slipping away from them, their lives unraveling with every beat of the pendulum. "We need to act fast, before we lose everything." The clock's hands moved, slow but steady, each tick a countdown to something they could no longer escape. Desperation gnawed at Sarah as she and William searched for any way to free themselves from the clock's grip. After hours of poring over websites, old archives, and forgotten forums, Sarah found a name: Elena Grendel, the last known living relative of Matthias Grendel, a descendant of the Clockmaker himself. Sarah tracked her down, an address in a small town just an hour away. William was reluctant, his skepticism about finding help growing stronger by the day, but Sarah insisted. She had felt the clock's curse tightening around them. It wasn't just the ticking anymore. The house itself seemed to warp around them. Time stretched, bent and twisted in ways that left them disoriented, lost. They couldn't risk wasting another day. The drive to Elena's home was tense, the car's silence broken only by the faint ringing in their ears, the phantom echo of the clock that now seemed ingrained in their minds. When they arrived at the small, dilapidated house nestled at the end of a dirt road, they exchanged wary glances. It didn't look like the kind of place where answers waited, but when Elena opened the door, they knew they had come to the right place. She was old, much older than they had expected, with thin white hair and deep wrinkles etched into her face, but her eyes were sharp, piercing, as if they held years of knowledge too dark to share easily. The moment she saw them, her expression shifted to one of grim understanding. "You've brought me a clock, haven't you?" she said without preamble, her voice raspy but firm. Sarah swallowed hard, nodding. "It's one of Matthias Grendel's clocks. We think it's cursed." Elena stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. "Not cursed," she murmured as they walked through the creaking hallway into her cramped living room. "Crafted, deliberately." They sat down, the weight of her words settling over them like a shroud. William, who had been silent for most of the drive, finally spoke. "We need to know how to stop it. The clock is doing something to us. It's stealing our time." Elena nodded, as though she had heard this story many times before. "Matthias was brilliant," she began, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had rehearsed these words many times. "But he was obsessed with immortality. He believed that time was a force that could be manipulated, controlled, and he wasn't entirely wrong." She paused, her gaze drifting to the floor as if lost in memory. "He built clocks that did more than tell time. They harvested it. Every tick of the pendulum stole a fraction of the owner's life. And Matthias, he found a way to collect that time, to use it for himself. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. You mean, he's still alive? In a sense, Elena said softly. He bound his soul to his masterpiece, the clock you now have in your home. The more time it takes from you, the more it sustains him. Over the years, many people have owned that clock, and all of them lost their lives to it. Slowly, painfully. William leaned forward, his knuckles white. Then how do we stop it? Elena sighed, her eyes heavy with the weight of impossible knowledge. You can't destroy it. It's tied to something far older than any of us. But there may be a way to sever its connection to you before it takes everything. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. How? Elena stood and moved to a small cabinet, pulling out a worn, leather-bound book. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for, an old faded diagram of a clock, eerily similar to the one in their home. The only way to stop the clock from draining your life is to reverse the spell that binds it to you, but doing so requires a sacrifice. Sarah and William exchanged uneasy glances. A sacrifice? William asked, his voice thin. Elena nodded. One life must be offered to break the curse. Matthias designed his clocks to feed on life, and it will not release you until it's consumed what it craves. The room felt colder, the air thick with the weight of her words. Sarah's mind raced, the thought of offering up a life, any life, filling her with horror. But what choice did they have? If they didn't act, the clock would take both of them. Is there no other way? Sarah whispered, already knowing the answer. Elena shook her head. The clock demands its due. You must decide whether to let it take you or someone else. The ticking of the clock, though miles away, echoed in their minds like a death sentence. The drive home was silent, the weight of Elena's words pressing down on them like a heavy fog. Sarah stared out the window, watching the barren trees blur into a darkened smear as they sped down the road. Her mind raced with the implications of the choice they had to make. A sacrifice. The words echoed in her thoughts, cold and cruel. William gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He hadn't spoken since they'd left Elena's house, and Sarah could feel the tension radiating from him. The silence between them felt like a chasm, growing wider with each passing second. "What are we going to do?" Sarah finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I don't know. How are we supposed to make a decision like that? We can't just sacrifice someone." Sarah felt a lump forming in her throat. She couldn't bear the thought of offering up an innocent life to save themselves, but she could feel the clock's grip tightening on them both. The headaches had worsened, the bouts of exhaustion becoming more frequent. She knew they didn't have much time left before the clock claimed them entirely. When they pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before them, its dark windows staring back like hollow eyes. The ticking had been with them, even in the car, always faint, just out of earshot, but constant. Now, as they stepped inside, it greeted them again, louder and more insistent than before. Tick, tick, tick. Sarah and William stood in the doorway, staring at the clock. It seemed different somehow, larger, darker, as though it had fed on their fear, growing stronger with every passing day. The pendulum swung back and forth with a steady rhythm, each movement precise, deliberate. "I can't do this," William muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I can't make that choice." "We don't have to," Sarah said, her voice shaking. Maybe there's another way. Maybe Elena didn't know everything. But deep down, Sarah knew they were running out of options. The clock would not release them. They had seen the toll it had taken on their bodies, felt the weight of time slipping away. Every tick brought them closer to an end they couldn't escape. Suddenly, the ticking grew louder, sharper, reverberating through the house like a deafening heartbeat. Sarah clutched her head, wincing as a wave of pain shot through her skull. William groaned, staggering back toward the couch, his face pale and drenched in sweat. The clock's pendulum swung faster now, its rhythmic beat becoming erratic, frantic. Sarah's vision blurred, and the room seemed to tilt, the walls warping around her. Time itself felt like it was unraveling, pulling her deeper into a dizzying spiral. Sarah. William's voice sounded distant, distorted. She tried to focus, but the ticking consumed her, filling her mind with the relentless sound. And then the room shifted. One moment she was standing in their living room, and the next she was somewhere else entirely. A dark workshop filled with the smell of oil and metal. Shadows flickered on the walls, cast by the dim glow of a single lantern. At the center of the room stood a man, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a face lined with age. Matthias Grendel. He worked meticulously at a clock, his fingers moving with precision, adjusting gears and springs with a careful, deliberate touch. The ticking echoed around them, filling the workshop with an oppressive weight. Sarah tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Grendel turned toward her, his hollow gaze locking onto hers. "You see now," he whispered, his voice thin and rasping, like the creak of an old door. "Time is a precious thing, but for some, it is never enough." He stepped closer, his figure looming over her like a specter. "The clock feeds, it takes, and I live." Sarah backed away, her heart pounding. She could feel the clock pulling at her, draining her life with every breath she took. "You can stop this," she gasped, desperation clawing at her. "You built it. You can end it." Grendel's lips curled into a twisted smile. "I have given you the tools. You know what must be done. A life must be taken. Time must be restored." The room swirled around her, and suddenly she was back in the living room, gasping for breath. William stood beside her, his face etched with fear. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I saw him," Sarah whispered, shaking. "Grendel, he said the same thing. One life for another." William's face went pale, his eyes wide with horror. "Sarah, no." But before she could answer, the clock's ticking grew deafening, filling the house with its final toll. Tick, tick, tick. They were out of time.